to hit, but in order to keep flowing through the book of Corinthians, I would encourage you with verse 13 that we kind of glossed over last week, that God will not give us temptation or let us be tempted beyond our ability, but He provides a way of escape. It's a verse that should bring comfort to us as Christians, that He is even in control of our temptations. And therefore, as we look at this week, one of our greater temptations, even that we certainly have in Christ all that we need for. So let us look at verses 23 and following. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then don't eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or whether you drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they might be saved. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. As we've been going through the book of Corinthians, there is a motto in the church of Corinth. The motto that we really haven't stated up to this point is begun in chapter 6, which we dealt with, and then he comes over to chapter 10 and he echoes it again. And their motto, I think we could say, is "Let freedom ring." They had a real sense of defending their Christian liberty. They had a real sense of defending this idea of freedom in Christ. And so that's been a theme that we've kind of been hitting, and we're going to continue on that with the Christian. Liberty in the Christian life was king in Corinth. And they're coming to Paul, who, if we were to put it in kind of the modern day, the way the church is dealing with things, we'd call him a recovering Pharisee, or whatever you want to put it there. What's his response going to be to this idea that freedom is king? I mean, shouldn't that be his response? He's just going to jump on this bandwagon. He's going to go with it. So they're sending him, or he's hearing this idea that, everything's lawful for me. I'm free to do whatever I want to do. And what will his response to be? Our natural response, we have two different natural responses in this situation. And one is to stick with what is safe. So Paul could have said, "No, offer to idols, stay away from the meat entirely." Or probably the more natural, at least in our society nowadays, is to swing the pendulum completely, right? And reject everything that you've known up to that point and just say, we are as free can be. Put it in a different way, one is to stay in the bathwater, and the other is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you can either stay as safe as you can and just stay in the dirty bathwater, or you just throw the bathwater and everything that is good out with it in the name of freedom. But Paul looks for door number 3 here. He looks somewhere else between those two options, and his place of looking is King Jesus, the glory of God. But this too has a little twist, because as we get to the end, if I can paraphrase it, he says, "I'm living to the glory of God, and therefore I'm a man pleaser." So it's a little bit tricky, but think the point of it is one that we need and will be helpful to us this evening. So if I could sum all this up, we have Paul, a former Pharisee, who doesn't jump on the freedom bandwagon and calls himself a man-pleaser to the glory of God, sort of. So that's your introduction thesis right there. This is what we're dealing with in this text. So how does this help us today, and what is the point that he's really making? The point that we have to see from the beginning. In this, if you've got the ESV, it says in the subheading, do all to the glory of God. I hope you know that subheadings are not in the original Greek. Those are things that are added for our being able to break up pages in the English Bible. They can be helpful, but they're not in the text. So that's the summary that they give to this text, though. And what Paul is emphasizing is that our freedom, even our freedom, falls under the kingship or the lordship of Jesus Christ. So he makes 2 points here. He says, go ahead and eat whatever they sell in the market, or eat whatever happens if you decide to go to your neighbor's house and they serve you meat. Eat it all. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Paul is still talking about meat. Imagine if you got to go hear Paul speak one sermon, and you travel and you get one shot to go. I mean, like some of the different people, maybe you get to hear R.C. Sproul once, or John MacArthur once, or whoever it may be. You get Apostle Paul one time, and you go and visit, and people go, what did he speak about? He was talking about meat. We're kind of there, I get it. I'm sure you came in tonight, so we're really going to be talking about meat again tonight. And I have good news for you. We're moving on to head covering next Sunday night, so just enjoy that while it comes. We could have been talking about meat again if I'd have broken this into another sermon, but we're going to continue to move on. But it is very important, and not for the sake of meat. This is the reason it's important, is because of this phrase he uses twice within the discussion: the earth is the Lord and all of its fullness. And here's why I believe this is so important. Here's why it is important within the text. It's one thing to talk about glorifying God, and you've got to glorify God in all of your life. And we talk about it that way. It's one thing to talk about that in a vacuum. It's another to talk about it in something very specific. It's one thing to talk about Christ being Lord of your life. It's another thing to talk about Christ being Lord of your life at the dinner table or in your social life. And really, that's what Paul is hitting at here. He's going, when you go over to your friend's house, here's what's important. When they serve dinner, here's where you get to display whether Christ is Lord of your life or not Lord of your life. Something that you and I may think is very immaterial. He's going, this is a lordship issue. You guys are trying to dub this off as this is all freedom, but Christ is Lord of everything. He's Lord of your social life. He's Lord of your eating habits. He is Lord of your freedoms. And obviously, Paul's not bringing up eating out of nowhere. It was the issue of the day in Corinth. But neither did he simply say, I just want to preach a sermon about you knowing that Christ is Lord, or you need to glorify God. No. He says, let's deal with what you're dealing with on Friday nights and Saturday nights. Go shopping, buy the meat, do it to the glory of God. But if somebody asks you over to their house and they happen to say to you as they're serving you dinner on Saturday night, by the way, this is offered to idols, don't eat it. For Christ is Lord. So one time you can buy the meat because Christ is Lord, and the next time you have to say no to somebody serving you something at dinner because Christ is Lord. Now let me try to go through this again. Paul is agreeing meat is not the big issue, but you displaying that Christ is Lord over everything and everything to you is the issue. Let Christ be seen through your use of your freedoms. And we could go off on a huge rabbit trail, but I just want to briefly say that that is a far cry from what we are seeing and hearing in our culture today from every side. We don't have many issues with meat, do we? We can say, thankfully, it's not really an issue. You and I can probably, maybe there's one person in here, but most of us can honestly say we have never been to anybody's house and they have said before they served us the meal, by the way, this meat has been offered to idols. If you have, come talk to me afterward. It'll be a great discussion, but it's probably not going to change anything I'm going to say after this point. But you and I daily hear people talk about their freedoms. And very often within the context, or not very often within the context of their freedoms, does the Lordship of Christ ever come up. And that brings us to our second point, and hopefully you'll see the tie-in in that. Our freedom is to be to the profit of many. Our freedom is under the lordship of Christ, but our freedom in that is also to the profit of many. So many cries of freedom, and you hear it, and this is what you hear in society, and this is why we've got one of the major reasons we've got the problem and dilemma right now is because everybody's talking about their freedoms, and in the context of the freedom, what ends up being the focus are my rights. My freedom. And Paul's saying that flies in the face of Christianity. And he's really saying this to both sides that are on this issue of meats, whether they eat the meats or whether they have nothing to do with the meats. All you're talking about is yourselves. Do you get that? Can you hear that? Where is Christ being over these things even in this conversation? So often that's the real danger when we begin to talk about, and one side of the issue talks about their freedoms and their rights, then the other's like, well, if you're going to talk about that, then let me talk about my freedoms and my rights and what's going to be taken away from me. And all of a sudden we're so pitted against each other because we're so consumed with ourselves. I'm not saying I'm going to solve the problems, but I'm hoping by the end of this evening that you're at least fixing your gaze on somebody besides yourself. Mainly that you're fixing it on King Jesus. The media, our media knows this so well, this dynamic of my rights and focusing on it. And if they can create or focus on a victim, then they can sway people to turn against other people in order to promote their agenda. It's a modern day machine that is being used. And they do this for the noble reason that they believe that they can generate change for the better or for the good in this based on their agenda. But really all they're doing is focusing on our self-idolatry. And say, well, we've got a lot of power in that. I think Paul's really writing to the church at Corinth and saying, well, you guys have a lot of, and are giving a lot of power to the idol of self. And I'm not hearing anything about Christ being Lord over any of this meat. Christ's lordship is supposed to free us to be others focused because it's all His. In other words, it frees us from possibly our greatest slavery that exists. And I know if I say, what's the greatest slavery that exists? You know the Sunday school answer is to say sin, but I'm going to tell you, I think that's the wrong answer. The greatest slavery that exists is the slavery to self. That's at the heart of our sin. That's at the heart of our cry, our independence, our freedom. And what Paul hears in the church at Corinth is, you guys are just enslaved to yourself still. You're talking about freedom in Christ, but there's no Christ in the picture. You're talking about yourselves still. We worship self. We serve self. We are slaves to self. And then this is where so much of our talk of our freedom keeps us self-focused and enslaved to self. And I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever pleases me. I can do whatever benefits me. And Paul says, not so for the Christian. A Christian should not think this way, not even in his liberty. A Christian, and this is, he gives this away at the end, should think like Christ. He says, be imitators of me as I imitate Christ. A Christian should think like Christ. So that in action, and going back, and this is repetitive to what I've already said, but you've got to see this. He says, so go buy meat. If it's on sale, it's okay. You don't have to ask, was it offered to idols? Was it not offered to idols? Take the deal. Be happy with the deal. Eat the deal. Maybe it's your birthday and you want to buy a prime cut and it costs a little more. And you don't have to worry about the prime cuts being offered to idols. You go ahead, you buy the meat. It's all Christ's. Those idols have no power over this meat whatsoever. Just eat the meat. Forget about that part of it. But if you go to your coworkers to celebrate his birthday and he knows that you're a Christian and he says, I think you ought to know this might have been offered to an idol. He says, don't eat it. But he says, and here's why you don't eat it. Because they don't think Christians should eat this meat. He says, here's why I don't want you to eat it. Because I want you to demonstrate them that you are wholly Christ's. Do you see that? Do you get that? He said, the reason you don't eat it is not for your conscience, it's for their conscience, because they say Christians aren't supposed to do this, so don't do it and say, well, I can do whatever I want. Don't do it so that they can see that Christ is supreme, that Christ is king. In other words, when they say that, they're sensing a dilemma. Have you ever been in that situation where they're like, I want to go to this movie, but I know you're a Christian. At that point, he's going, just tell them you don't want to go. I know you're a Christian and we're going to this place. And they're saying, I know that there's a dilemma here. And he said, it's okay at that point, and you do it for their conscience. You go, okay. You know what? If you think there's a dilemma there, I want you to know that we don't need to go there. In other words, you do whatever demonstrates to them in their conscience that you are wholly bowed to Jesus Christ. It's very different than the way we often portray pleasing all men. A Christian should live a life that says, I can do whatever pleases me. A Christian should live a life that says, my life is under Christ's lordship.